Siegel, and I'm really excited to be here for an Ask Me Anything session. It's really a wonderful moment of NowMaps coming out into the world, and thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to your questions and the conversation that we can begin. So let's start. If there are any questions, please send them in, and I'll do my best to respond in a way that I hope will be helpful for you. So the first question is saying, I'm a school-based therapist. Do you recommend the Now Maps for classrooms? And in fact, that's one of the main usages would be for a classroom setting, as well as to parenting and the experience of therapists in therapy. But classrooms are an ideal setting because what Now Maps does is it takes some basic ideas about mind sight, about seeing the mind inside oneself, knowing the mind of someone else, and integrating those, meaning really building on relationships with kindness and compassion. And those are the components you may be familiar with that are the foundations for not only mind sight skills, but for the ways in which we build social and emotional intelligence. So, for a classroom, this would be ideal. We have two books. One is for very young kids in preschool and kindergarten, and the other be for kids in primary school. So we have that Now Maps Junior would be a more rhyming, story-based way of learning these mindsight skills. And the Now Maps Straight is a book of discovery for really for tweens, especially to read the book themselves with a teacher's guidance so that they learn these skills. And we can talk about what those are as we go. But with Dina Margolin, what I was able to do as Dina was working in our Mindsight Institute was take the ideas of interpersonal neurobiology and then translate them for what a child could actually use at whatever developmental stage they were at. So Now Maps is kind of like the children's version of Brainstorm for adolescents, where they read it themselves. This is now taking those same ideas and making them available for children. So let's see our next question. Can you explain name it to tame it? Absolutely. Thank you, Brittany. The name it to tame it term was, I like rhyming and mnemonics that help you remember things. And some colleagues at UCLA, and then also at some other institutions, had found that when you named the emotion you saw in a picture that you were being given as a visual cue inside a brain scanner, if you named, let's say, just the gender of the person you were seeing or the length of their hair or something not related to the emotion, then the linguistic centers on the left side of the brain didn't do anything to calm the intense reaction of the more bodily based input to the right side of the brain. And so that didn't do anything. But when you named the emotion you saw, that correspondence between the feelings that came up from the body, registered primarily in the right side of the brain initially, and the linguistic centers in the left led to a calming in the brain. So initially, I called that name it to tame it, and people like that term because it rhymes. But then a colleague of mine who's African American said that that phrase actually made her feel very uncomfortable because of the history of slavery and of taming slaves. So lately, I have stopped using name it to tame it and have started using name it to frame it, meaning placing what you experience in a frame, like a picture, like that picture, which has a story. And so name it to frame it is the new term I'm using to really respect, in a way, the blind spot I had for the word tame. And for some people with a history of slavery, other colleagues of mine don't find any issue with name it to tame it, but this one colleague did. And just to avoid any kind of negative feelings that arise and that feel disrespectful, then name it to frame it is what I use to capture the same exact ideas of how to allow linguistic naming to lead to physiological calming. Thank you for that question. So, Lisa, you're asking how to widen your window of tolerance. Yes, exactly. So, the window of tolerance is another term I made up to try to capture the findings that were both clinical and some aspects of research, where certain intensities of response uh, could be seen to go toward chaos or toward rigidity. And when you were between those two, you were in a state of harmony. So when I was experiencing that as a clinician or in my own life, I realized the states of harmony were really states of integration where you're differentiating and linking, and that creates a flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized and stable state. So that's another term I made up called phases. And that phases flow is harmony, basically. So the way you widen a window of tolerance for a given situation or interaction or emotion or memory. So we have many windows of tolerance, but the general idea is, let's say, let's say for me, I had this really painful experience of as a 14-year-old being responsible for taking care of the strawberry plants. I put some snail poison out to kill the snails, but I forgot to tell my parents not to let my puppy out, even though I read on the package that pets should not be eating this stuff, and I was going to wash it down in the morning. Anyway, the next day, sadly, my puppy was dead. So I had a very narrow window of tolerance for any kind of threat of poisons. Let's just be very specific about it like that. And so I would freak out if there would be any kind of chemical substance. And so, when we had later on, I had children and we decided to get dogs and we had a puppy and a vitamin dropped on the floor, I freaked out. So I stopped being integrated, meaning I couldn't see the pill had dropped. I couldn't find it. My dog was going, there was one vitamin. So clearly I had some unresolved issues. So in this case, the way to widen the window would be I could still have emotions of fear and concern, but I could stay integrated. So I could be flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. So I had to do work with my therapist to really look at the edges of, what that experience was. And so to widen my window for dogs. And recently we got a rescue puppy, and I had to do similar kind of work around, things she was eating in the backyard and different things that were going on. And I could feel, so it wasn't a matter of intensity, it was a matter of integration. People have taken that term and used it for, the idea of tolerating high intensity or low intensity. But the initial idea was much broader than that, that the window of tolerance is all about integrative flow within the window, and widening it involves learning to differentiate and link things that before would have sent you into intolerable states of chaos or rigidity. And now that's how you do it, by integrating the experience. And naming it to frame it would be one example for what happened with my dog, doing deep somatic work, doing all sorts of ways where you tie things together. The Mindsight book offers ways to integrate things. And even in NowMaps, you see lots of ways to integrate things, which would help children widen their windows of tolerance. So thanks for that question. And I hope that was a useful, even if long, response. Okay, any ideas where to start with children with chronic low self-esteem? Thank you. It's really interesting that the word esteem. And I would begin with what we do in the NowMaps book, actually, is to work with self-compassion, that term that Kristen Neff has coined. I would use the term, instead of self-compassion, inner compassion, because what we try to teach in NowMaps and in a new book I have, Intra-Connected, coming out soon, the idea of a self only being in your body, I think, is a serious problem. So as teachers, as parents, as therapists, broadening what we use as our boundaries of self to be much broader than the brain, certainly much bigger than the body even, is important. But inner compassion is a really useful way, and I think Kristen Neff's important research shows this, that self-esteem is dependent on the reactions of others to how am I doing? Am I looking good in their eyes? So you can have low self-esteem where you're constantly interpreting what others think of you as a measure of who you actually are. So inner compassion would be a way where you recognize that the feelings you have are valid, that you have value, that you can actually know what you're feeling. And the way to work with that is to develop a relationship, if you're talking about being a therapist, with a child, or even as a parent, and to really get to what the child's actually feeling. And so one of my clients, my first patients who I ever worked with as a trainee, she actually had very low self-esteem, in quotes, but through the course of therapy that improved. And when I asked her what happened, she had this amazing thing. She said never in her life before had she had the experience of feeling felt. And that notion of you is the PART, the part you can play as a teacher, a therapist, or a parent. And we talk about this in NowMaps. You have presence, attunement, resonance, and trust. As you do that, the child will feel felt, and over time will develop more compassion inwardly and more integration, which I think is when people talk about low self-esteem, that's what they mean. So thank you for the question, Victoria. Thank you. Wonderful questions. I love the whole brain child. Thank you. And can't wait for Now Maps. Yes, here it comes. What inspired you to write books for children? What inspired me to write books for children was my experience with Brainstorm, actually, which was a book I wrote directly for adolescents, about how their brain changed during the adolescent period, the difference between adolescence and teenage years, and basically inviting them to look at their essence. The feedback from the adolescents themselves was so rewarding to me that I felt it would be important to have a way to actually directly speak to children. So, as you know from the Whole Brain Child and other books I've written with Tina Payne Bryson, we always have little pages for a child, Whole Brain Kids, for example, and it's just a page that basically take these mindsight lessons and give them directly to children. So at our Mindsight Institute, we're all about teaching about how you see the mind. So it became very natural then to say, okay, let's do it. So one of my students who then became associated at the Mindsight Institute, Dina Margolin, she and I started working on, well, how would you take the mindsight ideas that I'd applied with Tina, who used to be my student, now is my colleague? We applied that for parenting. How would you actually apply it directly to children? She was doing this directly as a young therapist herself. So we put together the NowMaps view. A NowMap essentially is a mindsight map. And we thought the word mindsight would be too like complicated for a very young child, especially in preschool. So the term NowMap is actually the colloquial way of saying a mindsight map. And these are maps of the mind. So that's where that came from. And I'm super excited to do this with Pessy, and I'm really happy with how the books came out. I have them somewhere, right? Someone just cleaned up my little messy desk here. I'll find it in a moment. It was put somewhere. Where did they go? But I'm really excited to have them out. So we'll see them soon. And there you can see how to get them. So there they are, those beautiful books. So let's get the next question. I'm going to see if I can find these books. Where did they put them? Okay. Anyway, there you'll see a picture of them. So in the next question, we have from Sebastian, what is the best way to teach a child who does not experience support from his parents to express his emotions? Now, if you're talking about being a therapist, I like to start with something neutral. Which would be like, what's the feeling in your fingers? What do you feel in your feet? Maybe moving slowly. What do you feel in your face? What do you feel inside your heart? What do you feel in your stomach, in your gut, basically? Now, all of these interior signals, and this is a part of the NowMaps way that we have, what we call a compass, which is basically the wheel of awareness made for children. This compass allows you to aim the direction into what in scientific terms would be called interoception. So all sorts of studies, including studies at UCLA with these same colleagues, show that the more interoception you have, perception, that's the perception part of the interior, the more you build an area of the brain called the insula, especially the anterior insula on the right side of the brain. And so as you stream energy and information flow with awareness and the choice to focus attention on these internal signals, you're basically having where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows. So you're actually growing the right anterior insula. Now, the studies are really amazing that the more you grow the ability for interoception, the more insight you have and the more empathy you have. And so, in terms of your question, how do you get them to express emotions? That's one part of insight, is to say, this is what my body is feeling. And then translating those bodily sensations into emotions. And especially for young children, I would stay with the simple, even if they say, I feel good, I feel bad. When you look at how bodily sensation is moving up into the head brain, and then the cortical processes construct emotions, basically, you know, way before even they get to the linguistic centers. If they can just go good or bad, that's a great starting place. So as adults, we shouldn't say, no, I say more than good, say more than bad. There's a hedonic uh, um, evaluation going on. Is it good or bad? And if they're starting with that word, that's fantastic. So that's what we try to do also in the NowMaps. So I would start with interoception, and there are ways in the NowMaps book you will see step-by-step guides to building exactly that ability to express emotions. So thanks, Sebastian. Okay, let's see. This is Victoria. I've read that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism, and developmental trauma can present um, in the same in children. Oh, so they look overlapping. What's your view on this? Also, is there a way to understand the overlap and differences between these diagnoses? Thanks. This is such a great question. Thank you, Victoria. So let's just start by really acknowledging that each of these, what are called, conditions, or, I so hesitate to use the word disorder, but disorders, um, have uh, aspects to them that are very controversial. So I want to honor the controversies. So I may say things that may seem overly simplistic. Uh, and I want to try to avoid that. So I want to apologize ahead of time for that. So let's go backwards with developmental trauma. And this is, the area I'm trained in, not just in trauma, but as an attachment researcher. You know, developmental trauma falls under our area of study. And so, in the developing mind, that in third edition of the textbook, you're going to see a tremendous amount of science about that. And the idea is that experiences that overwhelm the ability to cope directly affect the capacity to integrate different networks in the brain. And part of that can come up as, distractibility that looks like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but actually is very different from that. So when you do essential aspects of attention in neuropsychological testing, it actually appears differently, even though attention can be because attention is just the process that regulates energy and information flow. So attention can be disrupted in all sorts of conditions. So that's the first thing. So in developmental trauma, what we see is dissociation. And if you come to our website, Dr. Dan Siegel, we have this incredible moment, by the way, of, people have asked for a course on developmental trauma, disorganized attachment, and dissociation, which is one of the outcomes of this impaired integration in the brain. And we're going to do that through the lens of dissociative identity disorder. And a former patient of mine, who's now a therapist, had the great idea. She texted me, because she's now my colleague, and said, "Hey, if you're going to do that course, I will come on, and if it's helpful, and I'll talk about what it was like to be your patient." So we're just about to get into that course. I say this because, there would be many ways where someone can look at dissociation, and if they're not careful, they could think it's attention problems, because attention is going from here to here to here, even though it's dissociative state shifts. So on the outside, it could say, oh my God, they're going and they can't pay attention. But it's actually a very different process. Dissociation is very different from, and there's many forms of ADHD. So it's hard to summarize that. But, um, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, at least in the way in child psychiatry we think of it, is not a developmental trauma outcome, but developmental trauma can have challenges to attention for sure. And not only that, but because the hippocampus isn't developing so well, you can have trouble remembering. So for sure, there's learning issues with developmental trauma, but for ADHD, it has a different kind of profile. And the first chapter I ever wrote was for the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry that I now co-authored with Lou Cozzolino. And you'll see the details of how attention deficit looks different from when you do the testing. Maybe on the surface it looks the same. So you're right; they can present looking similarly. Now, with people who have these experience that's called autism or on the spectrum, and I recently did a conversation with a young man who was on the spectrum, who was diagnosed as autistic right before the play called A Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is about an adolescent with autism. And someone just turned me on to a Netflix special called The Extraordinary Attorney Woo from South Korea about an attorney with autism. So you can kind of see that. But in the experience of teaching and being a part of this panel, the three things that go along with autism are actually somewhat different from ADHD when you get into the details of them, and they can be very different from developmental trauma. So I want to be really clear that when you look at the research on autism, on people on the spectrum, which some people say, let's not call it a disorder, and let's say it's being neuroatypical, but not a disorder. So we want to honor that. When you look at it, whether you call it a disorder or just a neuroatypical presentation, the three things that are present are some form of sensory integration challenge. So incoming input floods the person, and you see this in that documentary not documentary, the show in Korea. They powerfully show that. So sensory integration challenges, that leads, as a person is flooded, to emotion regulation challenges. And one of the most intense social experiences we have is engaging with other people. So then social engagement and learning how to make mind-sight maps, basically maps of the interior of other people first, and then even of yourself, are compromised because to avoid the emotion dysregulation, you avoid the social interaction. And you can see this as early as 6 months. So this profile, those three things, sensory integration, emotion regulation, and social interaction challenges, are quite different from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and the dissociation of developmental trauma. So it's important to distinguish them because the interventions can be quite different. But, we showed in a pilot study at our Mindful Awareness Research Center, and you can see this in a book by Lydia Zalowska, that you can actually, for people who do have attention challenges, use mindfulness interventions. And what we want to do is see if that same intervention would work. Of course, it can work with trauma in a very positive way, but see, no one's done the study yet, as far as I know, of people on the spectrum. So anyway, those are just some thoughts. And I know we're over time already, and I want to take one more time, if it's okay, to do one more question. And let me see if I can see it. When is NowMaps coming out? That's the question. So I can easily remember it because it's my son, my wonderful son, Alex Siegel. Go to his music on Spotify. Yay. It's his birthday. So if I have it right, and I'll ask Kate this, it's October 11th of this year, 2022. So that's when it's coming out. You can see the two books there. I just want to remind you that one of the books, is for kids, 7, 8, up to about 12. Probably even younger kids, I think, can handle that book too. But that's NowMaps, and NowMaps Junior is a book, that's rhyming stories that are just, I find, so beautifully illustrated by our wonderful illustrators. Same for both. So you get the same message, which is basically you're going to learn these NowMaps tools, which include a pause button, so the child learns with a visual image of a button. I'm going to pause. And that's basically, if you know the wheel of awareness practice, that's accessing the hub of the wheel so you can explore the different things on the rim. You get the opportunity to have an OK monitor, which is basically assessing your window of tolerance. Am I in the window of tolerance and I'm okay? Or am I going into chaos or rigidity, where I'm sort of almost at the edge, I'm sort of not okay, or I'm way not okay. So then you do the interventions, which include you using this mindset compass, this NowMaps compass, to determine all these different things going on, basically with that pause. And what all that stuff does is give you the idea of a mindsight map, a now map that says what's happening now, so I can know what's going on, I can name it to frame it, and I can move in a direction that's positive for me and the people I'm interacting with. And it's basically, as Dan Goleman said in the forward to a book I wrote called Mindsight, these mindsight skills that you learn in NowMaps, according to Goleman, are the basis of social and emotional intelligence. So NowMaps will be an incredible resource for parents, for teachers, for therapists, all to use directly with children, reading these books with children for the NowMaps Junior, and even children reading it themselves and having fun of reading it together for NowMaps. So thanks for being here for our Ask Me Anything NowMaps opening. I'm super excited about that, and thank you for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer, and I'll look forward to connecting with you more about NowMaps in the October time when it's released. Thanks so much.